Great. Well, thanks everyone for being here today. We're super excited to see everyone and to have you joining us here today for day 2 of Career Week. Today, we're going to be talking about resumes and we'll probably talk just a little bit about other documents that are part of the job search, internship search process. Yesterday, we talked about Handshake and all of the functionality that Handshake has. If you missed that session, like Heather said, all of the events this week will be recorded and will be up on a playlist on YouTube, probably next week sometime. Next week, or tomorrow, not next week, tomorrow's session will be about networking. So all of our tips and tricks and ways to make networking feel more comfortable. Heather will be going through all of that tomorrow at noon, and tomorrow's session. I've got next week on my mind. Just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Dana Quist, and I'm one of the career counselors in the Engineering Career Center here at UVA, and I'm joined by Heather Palmer and Frances McBride, who are my colleagues here in the Career Center. We work with engineering students and the BA CS students across grounds, and work a lot of times hand in hand and closely with the main University Career Center that serves all students at UVA. So I'm going to be leading the presentation today, but Heather and Frances will probably be adding their thoughts and ideas about resume best practices as well. So now that you know a little bit about us, we're going to do just a quick poll to see who's with us today. So we're going to ask you what year in school you are and what your major is. We're going to start with you're in school. If you want to answer that for us, that'll give us a good idea of who's here today. Almost everyone. And that, so you can see we have graduate students, third-year students are our biggest categories, fourth year, and some first and second years too. So great, good to see everyone. I'm going to do our second one. You can tell us what major you are, then we'll get a sense of majors. And sorry, I had to combine mechanical and aerospace because the poll tool wouldn't let me add any more categories. Give everyone just another second or two. Okay, so computer science majors, BME, computer engineering, aero systems, so almost a little bit of everyone. Great, all right, that's awesome. So that helps us kind of get a feel for who's here today. So we're glad that you're all here, and hope you get some good information today about your resume. So like Heather said, we're going to put all the recordings together on a YouTube playlist for you to access at any time down the road if there are other sessions that you can't make. So one thing you might want to do as we're getting started is, if you want to, on your own computer, open up your resume and just have it open and maybe feel like you can make edits along the way. So we can kind of have it all be a work in progress. We can all be working on our resumes together. And whether or not you feel like you have, sometimes students come in to us for the first time, feel like they don't have enough information to make a good resume, or whether your issue is you have too much that is going over one page and you're trying to figure out how to pare down what you show on your resume. Hopefully this presentation will give you some good ways to think about new things that you might want to include that you have not thought of before, or ways to really target the information that you do have and make it as specific as possible. All right, so I'm going to share my screen for us. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Looks good.
Okay. All right, so we're going to be talking about resumes best practices. And I think one of the things students want to know is how do I make my resume stand out when employers are getting hundreds of resumes maybe for one job posting? How do you increase your odds of being selected for an interview and make your resume work as hard as it can for you? So we'll talk through all of that today. One thing I wanted to say before we get started is just to recognize and to think about that you are, as a person, much more than just your resume. I feel like sometimes the idea of creating this one-page document that's supposed to sum up everything that we've done, all of your accomplishments on this one page, it can feel it's just a little bit strange, I think, to feel like you have this one page that's supposed to represent you and everything and all of your skills and experience. So just keep in mind that you are much more than just a one-page document. And I encourage you to focus on your own journey and your own career path, and not to compare yourself to other students. We have, we see a really wide range of students and with different kinds of experiences. And whether you come to us and you're still trying to build up your experience, you're just getting started, or whether you have multiple kinds of experiences, we work with students at any stage of the process. All right, so let's start with just kind of the basics of the formatting of a resume. So in general, we'll say when you're getting it all set up, we start with 1-inch margins, but you can go down to no smaller than 1/2 inch around the top and bottom and sides. And that can be a great way to get a little more space on your resume to adjust those margins. Just like when I remember being in school, when you had a 10-page paper, but you only had 9 pages of text, when you realize I can adjust my margins a little bit bigger and make it stretch out a little further. Now we're generally working the other way, like using those margins as a way to get a little extra space out of your resume. Font size, I think, can be anywhere from 10 to 12. 10 is a little small. I like 10.5 or 11. 11 probably is the sweet spot for font size. Font styles, generally keeping it simple to just common, regular, everyday fonts, nothing fancy, I think is a good rule of thumb. We're trying to get a one-page document that you're happy with and can work with. I would say, I noticed we had some graduate students here, depending on how much experience you have between undergrad and graduate school and where you are kind of in the graduate school process. I think there are some exceptions for graduate students beyond one page. The heading is generally where we start with your personal information. A lot of times I'll see students with a heading and their name is the same font size as everything else. And generally you want your name to be a little bit bigger, makes it easier for the recruiters or the people reading the resumes to get that information quickly. We'll use a UVA email address rather than Google or personal email. I think it just is a little bit more official, a little bit more professional to use that UVA email. And we'll add a phone number, obviously, and that last one on the slide there should say LinkedIn. So you can add your LinkedIn URL. And also, we have a lot of computer science majors, if you have a GitHub that you have some code in that you want to share, you can include your GitHub there too. I see fewer and fewer resumes that have an actual street address on them. So I think generally just email and phone number and those other social media links are probably fine. And I think as a student now, we used to, you don't need to include, I would say, a local address and a permanent address. So maybe even, like I said, no street address necessarily at all anymore. So one thing I wanted to mention kind of while we're talking about format is you may have heard of applicant tracking systems that employers use. A lot of the big employers use them as a way to manage the number of resumes that they receive. And I think you can assume that if you're applying to a position at a large employer that they're going to use some kind of applicant tracking system. So that's another reason to use a common a common font size, a common font, sorry about that, and to keep your resume as simple as possible. A lot of times students will come to us with resumes that they found a template to help them get started that may have columns or may have some graphics in them, but applicant tracking systems will work best and will parse the information from your resume best the more simple the format. So we generally advise students not to use columns or graphics, no headers or footers within your document, and to keep the simple bullet points as the main way to add a little formatting to your resume. So it may feel really boring to have a resume that doesn't have any of those, that's just kind of what we might call standard resume. But I think anytime that you're applying through a company's website and where you think they might be using an applicant tracking system, that will increase your odds that your resume will make it through that system. So one thing that you can do is think about how you're applying, and maybe you have a resume that's your basic resume without a lot of without any color or columns or any of those kind of graphical elements that you use for the applicant tracking system. But you may want to also have a resume that has a little bit more of a design to it that you can use if you're handing it to someone in person at a career fair, or if you're going to email it to someone directly. You might have two versions of your resume there. Okay, so some other points about format. We probably some of my personal preferences are in terms of using italics or underline to emphasize areas on your resume. I generally don't like things underlined. I think it makes it harder to read, and I'm not a fan of italics either. I usually recommend that you use all caps or bold as a way to emphasize certain certain elements in your resume that will make it more readable. So that will just eliminate the variation in your resume and make it a little easier to read. And I'll stop and see if Heather and Francis, if there are any kind of formatting things that you like to recommend to students when they're thinking about how to format their resume.
I think you covered it all. The one thing maybe I'll emphasize under consistent format that I see, I would say like 90% of folks miss, so it's really common, no worries, is that when you're looking at your bullet points, just check the end of your bullet points right now if you have your resume open. Employers don't care whether you always end them with a period or don't use periods at the end, but they just want to see consistency in formatting. So I'll see that be off. And then I know this is like a really tiny detail, but also with date ranges. Sometimes people will use a small dash, sometimes Word makes a small dash a large dash, sometimes there's spaces on either side, sometimes there's not. So I just like to see consistency in how the dates are presented as well.
And I'll just add one small thing. I think you all have really covered it. With your name, you kind of want that to be the largest font on your resume. So your name should be a little bit larger than everything else.
Perfect. One thing for to mention around applicant tracking systems, sometimes students will ask us, should I save my resume as a PDF or save it as a Word document? And either of those generally is fine now. I think I used to hear people say only save it as a PDF, but now I think the tracking systems are able to really process either of those. So whichever format it works best for you is fine. Okay, and I added down here on the slide, the last item, a link to our engineering career center website that has a resume section where you can find some sample resumes, some just general resumes. There's an engineering resume, there's a first year resume, and then there's a template that you can use that has some information filled in already that you can replace with your own information if you want kind of a nice place to start.
Dana, we did get a question about what about a photo?
It's funny. A lot of times when you see like my little graphic here with a resume, they'll put what looks like a photo, but generally resumes don't have photographs on them. You'll have a photograph in your, picture in your LinkedIn profile, and that's fine, but not on your resume. Most of the time, they would just take up extra space that can be better utilized through information about your experiences and skills.
Culturally, I think there are some other countries or either just cultures that do have a photo on their resume where that's kind of what folks do, the standard, but yeah, definitely not for the US resume. Good question.
Okay, so kind of once you kind of have in mind how it's going to be formatted in general, what kind of information are you going to include? So generally sections that we see include education, skills, some type of experience, and maybe a leadership, extracurricular, community service kind of category. But really, one thing to think about is your resume is not like a job application. You don't have to include every single thing that you've done. It's really yours to include any information that you think is most related to the position that you're applying for. And that's one thing to keep in mind is that when you're creating your resume, you really are creating it with the reader in mind. So who's going to be looking at your resume and what kind of information are they going to be looking for? So I think always kind of keeping that in the back of your mind when you're filling out those sections. What is it? What can I say about my education or my experience that person reading is going to be most interested in? So we read top to bottom and left to right. So you want the first information that people read to be the most relevant and the most, what are they going to read that's going to keep them wanting to read more. So in general, as a student, that's why we start with an education section, because at this time, the fact that you're here at UVA, getting a degree is probably one of the most related information that you can provide. So we start with that education section. I think typically what we'll see often is a skills section after that, which is a nice place where you can tell employers what skills that you have. And I'll say that skills section, sometimes it can go after education. Sometimes we see it at the bottom as well. So it can move around, but it's nice to kind of start right off with, here's my related experience or my related education section, and here are the skills that I have that are most related to the position. So ideally, we're trying to get the next section after education and skills to be a section where you can really highlight the experiences and the experiences that you have that are related to the position that you're applying for. So there can be a number of ways to kind of group that information together, but generally it can be, it might be past internship experience, it might be part-time job experience, you might have research experience, there might be project experience from a project from a class, or maybe it's a personal project that you're doing on your own. It could be experience from a club that you're involved with. We have a lot of student organizations that allow students to get real related hands-on experience. So their goal is really to kind of get that information, get that experience grouped together and in a section that's as close to, that's as high up on your resume as possible. So these are just some categories that you might have on your resume. Other things that you might want to include could be hackathon experience, if you have participated in hackathons, if there are online courses that you've taken, maybe through Coursera or LinkedIn Learning, those can be great to include as well. If you have certifications that you've received, that can be nice, relevant information to include. And you can kind of get a sense of the fact that there's a lot of different kinds of experiences and information that you might want to include on your resume. So one kind of method of keeping track of all of that and really targeting the experience that you include to the position that you're applying for is to create some type of master resume. So you have maybe a master resume that's not something that ever gets sent out to an employer, but it's where you can keep track of all of those different types of experiences that you might have, again, through whether it's work or personal projects or online courses or clubs and organizations. You can keep all of that information in one place, and then based on the position that you're applying for, pick and choose what you decide to include on your resume for that particular employer. So a lot of us have more than one area that we're interested in, and sometimes you're looking at a variety of different positions. So that method of keeping a master resume and using that as a way to pick and choose really helps you kind of target a resume to a particular job. Okay, I'll just add one thing that I see often, and that used to be, I think, really popular to include on your resume, was some type of objective or just kind of a blurb about what it is that you're looking for. And I think that sometimes that can be appropriate, and a lot of it depends on what type of position you're looking for, what else is on your resume. But an objective can be nice, I think, if you're looking for a position that's not necessarily tied directly to your major. It's a great way to just make clear that you are interested in the type of position that you're applying for, even though it might not tie in with your major. It can be a great place to include if there's a really specific area within a type of work that you're interested in. It can be nice to clarify that. If you don't have necessarily a lot of information to include on your resume and you have some extra space to fill, it can be a way to just add some information about yourself that the reader might be interested in. All right. Heather or Francis, anything you guys want to add there?
Nothing else from me.
I think you covered it. Great job.
So we'll talk just a little bit about education section. So generally start with University of Virginia. I see a lot of students in the engineering school who don't include School of Engineering and Applied Science on their resume. So I think that's a nice to include that level, that specific school information there. So I always tell students I like to think of it like a funnel. We start at the top with UVA and we narrow it down to the School of Engineering, and then again to the major that you are within engineering or your College of Arts and Sciences and a BACS. I like to see a graduation date that's just the month and the year that you're graduating, not necessarily the inclusive dates of when you started and when you think that you'll finish. I think most employers can look at a graduation date and get the information they need from that. Every once in a while, there'll be a student who maybe thinks that they're going to finish early or not sure exactly what their graduation date is yet. And my advice generally is to just include the date that's at the moment what your best guess is for when you're going to graduate. And if that changes down the road, you can update that information later. And the same is true with your major. And if you're adding a minor or if you're adding a second major, put the information on your resume that's what you know to the best of your knowledge right then, what your intent is for major and minor. And if you need to update it, if that information changes down the road and you need to update it, then that can be updated later. For GPA, my advice generally is if it's greater than a 3.0 to include it on your resume. I have heard different advice along the way. Some I think say 3.5, but I think in general 3.0 and better gives the employer a nice view of your academic successes, and leaving it off, I think often you leave it up to them to assume something about your GPA that you might not necessarily want them to assume. There are definitely situations where students maybe, especially coming in, you had might have had a bad semester, or your GPA isn't where you would really like for it to be, and you don't want to include it on your resume, and that's fine. I think what we do in that instance is really kind of focus on making the most of the experience that you have, and really highlighting some of the related skills and kind of taking the focus off of GPA. I know that our office works with employers regularly, and we do what we can to educate them on our view is really that we would like employers not to be very GPA focused. And we are always encouraging employers to look beyond just GPA in terms of evaluating candidates. So and I think that definitely seems to be a trend in the right direction. Other things that you might want to include in an education section are related courses. I generally advise, if you are going to include a related coursework section, to make sure that they actually are related to, that they're courses that are related to the position that you're applying for, not just a list of all the classes that you've taken so far, but picking and choosing maybe 3 or 4 classes that are nicely related to what you're applying for. You might want to include study abroad if you've done a study abroad program. And I would say for first and second year students, you might also include your high school information in that education section. I think by the end of your second year, high school will generally drop off. But for first and second year, it's just a few years ago. So I think that information can be helpful. And it can be another way to show academic success before you have much of a great history here at UVA. So next, like we had talked about in the organization of your resume, often comes a skills section. And there's a number of ways to kind of categorize the different skills that you may have acquired. If you're first and second year, your skill section may be shorter and maybe includes just a language, a programming language, or some 3D printing experience. But as you progress through your program, you'll have more specific skills that you want to include. And it can be helpful, I think, to avoid, if you want to avoid just a list of skill, comma, skill, comma, skill, if you can group them into categories for the reader, I think it can help make sense of some of those skills that you have. Just make it a little more clear where you have experience. So obviously, this is just a comprehensive sample of different skills. No one's going to have all of this on their resume. But just like we read, like I mentioned before, that we read top to bottom and left to right, if you are including a skills section on your resume, start with the skills that are the most relevant to the job that you're applying for. So if you have a couple of different categories within skills, have the first one be the group that's the most relevant, and start that list with the skill that's the most relevant. Okay. I'm going to stop for a second and see if there are any, well, Francis and Heather, if you want to add anything, or if there are any students that have any questions so far.
I had a one-to-one message, like a private message, come through in chat, just asking if it's possible to get one-on-one feedback on our resume. And so you'll probably be covering this later, Dana, but just to let everyone know, we do recommend VMock, which is a tool that the university is paid for. It uses machine learning and natural language processing to look through your resume and give you some feedback. And so I recommend using that first to make any tweaks. And then you're welcome to schedule a one-on-one appointment with me, Dana, or Francis, and we'd be happy to look over your resume. On top of that, just to help you all out even further, last Friday of August and the first 2 of September, we're going to have employer and alumni volunteers available on Zoom to also offer feedback on your resume in a non-evaluative way. So they're not going to be critiquing it for a job and considering you for their company. They're just giving you feedback before you start submitting your resume. So yes, there are multiple ways. If you work on your resume after today's presentation and improve it, there's lots of ways to get feedback on it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Heather. Okay, so the kind of meat and potatoes of your resume is really going to be that experience section. And sometimes students will call it a variety of different names. Like I mentioned before, you can sometimes it'll be work experience, or it might be I like to call it related experience, but it can have a number. It's your resume. You can call that category whatever works best. You can even be very specific about the experience that you have. So if you're looking for something, say in cybersecurity, and you have some, maybe a class project, or you've been part of the cybersecurity club, you could have a cybersecurity experience section. And that's a really direct way of grouping together that experience that you have that is related to the position that you're applying for. So other example, if you're looking for something in robotics, and you could have a robotics experience section, or a research experience section if you're putting together a resume that's maybe for applying to graduate school. And you can use the job description for the position as a way to help you think through what the employer is looking for, and how you might categorize that section. So the beauty of, I think, using a related experience section means that it can include all kinds of experiences. So it can be internships, it could be a part-time job, it could be a personal project that you have, it could be volunteer experience, or experience that you have through a student club. So really it opens it up to any type of experience and skills that you've had that are related to the position that you're applying for. The way you keep it kind of consistent and looking consistent on your resume is setting up a project or a student club experience the same way that you would a job. So you might have a name of your personal project, and then maybe it's the class where you did the project, and then the dates for when you did that, just the same way that you would for a job experience or internship experience. One other thing to keep in mind when you're actually figuring out how you want to format each of those experiences within that section, you can start with the name of the organization, or you can start with the job title. And a lot of times, it's nice to think about what's going to grab the reader's attention the most. And again, like we read left to right. So the first thing that they read for each of those sections, you want to catch their attention. So if the name of the organization you feel like is more relevant or attention grabbing, then start with the name of the organization. But if your job title or your internship title you feel like seems more relevant, if you're looking for software development kind of internship and you have that experience, but maybe with a small company that no one's really heard of before, maybe you start with your job title. But if you worked at a company or an organization that has some name recognition, then maybe you start with the company name when you're setting up that on your resume. So all of it, we're always, again, kind of keeping in mind who's reading it and what information they're going to want to hear about first. Again, for students who are first and second years, your resume may still include some high school experiences. It may include some projects that you've done in class as a way to highlight engineering experience that you have. And as you kind of get a little further, into third and fourth year, some of that experience is going to drop off. And I think a lot of times when I talk to students and we're picking and choosing what they include on their resume, it feels a little bit sad sometimes to have those experiences, maybe from high school, that you put a lot of time and effort into. When you drop those off of your resume, it can feel like, oh, all this effort that I put into this experience isn't being highlighted anymore. But it's important to remember that all of that experience has gotten you where you are today. It doesn't mean that you can't talk about that experience in your interview. And the nice thing now about a LinkedIn profile or a Handshake profile, that gives you all the space that you need to include all of those experiences. So in a lot of ways, it's like kind of the master resume that I was talking about earlier. All of your experiences can be housed in your LinkedIn profile or a Handshake profile, but your resume is really where you can really dial in the experiences that you want to share with the employers. Any questions about experiences? Okay, I'll just say a few words about the extracurricular and leadership. Again, just to kind of keep that format consistent, you'll want to set them up to follow the same format as you did in the experience section. So if you started with organization name and then your title, location sometimes will include the city and state and the dates. You'll want to set up your extracurricular or leadership experience section in the same way. we want to, keeping in mind, if you want to include some detail around those experiences, especially if they're ones that are related to what you're applying for, using bullet points to go into some detail about the actual experiences can, I think, be a place where you can highlight those skills that are related. This can also be a great place to highlight maybe non-technical skills that we know employers are always looking for as well. And a lot of times, again, some students will have numerous experiences, extracurricular activities or clubs that they've been involved with, and it can be helpful to kind of pick and choose what you want to include on your resume so that you're using your space wisely and adding. I think sometimes it can be a lot more effective to have fewer items where you can add some detail versus just a laundry list of everything that you've ever been involved with. Okay, so now we've kind of talked about what your categories are and what the information is that you want to include, but really, I think thinking about the best way to use those bullet points and the best way to get the information across to the employers is really kind of the hardest part, or the trickiest part of putting your resume together. So for no matter whether you're describing a job experience or a club that you've been a member of, really thinking through being as concise and direct in your bullet point information is important. So we don't use any complete sentences on your resume. So you're not going to say I did XYZ. We're going to start with just a strong action verb, and that's, Heather was saying earlier, you don't have to put a period at the end but you can if you want to. We really just, because there aren't any complete sentences, if you just would rather not worry about periods altogether, that's fine. There are a number, sometimes finding the right action verb to use to start off that bullet point can be a little tricky, but we like to look for really kind of action-oriented verbs like create or built or designed, collaborated. And there's actually on the UVA Main Career Center page in their resume section, they have a nice list of a variety of action verbs by category that can be helpful sometimes if you're putting together your resume and you get kind of stuck. And sometimes we get stuck on certain words and can't think of other ways to say the same thing. That looking at a list like that can be helpful. And I don't know if Heather or Francis, if one of you want to put that link in the chat, that might be helpful for students. It's the Main Career Center resume page that has a link to those action verbs.
Sure, I got that.
Okay. The other thing about kind of starting your bullet point and finding the action verb that's right is figuring out what tense to use. So if it's a position that you're currently doing, we use present tense. If it's something that you've done in the past, we usually do past tense. So if it's something you're working on now, we'd say create or build or design. I see oftentimes students will put an ing on the verb, so creating or collaborating, but it's a little bit tidier just to use the present tense and not include that ing. And you just want to be consistent with that throughout. So if it's a current position, present tense. If it's past position, we use past tense. Okay, so when you're thinking about what to include in your bullet points and what really makes an effective description of an experience, I generally find that I'm encouraging students all the time to go into a little more detail than what they're what their maybe their first instinct is. And some of the detail that you might want to think about is thinking about like why you are doing the work that you are doing. So what was the ultimate goal of what it was that you were doing? What was the purpose of the task that you were assigned? Was it to make something better? Was it to save money? Was it to improve a process? Was it to generate new ideas? Thinking about the why behind what you were doing keeps you from keeps your bullet points from just being a laundry list of duties. You can also think about who you were doing it with. Like there's so much emphasis on teamwork from employers now. You know, being able to talk about other people that you collaborated with or worked with on a group as a group or on a team, I think can really add some just some detail that I think is relevant to probably skills that the employer is looking for and just adds interest. It's important to talk about how you did what you did. So if there were tools or mechanics of how you accomplished the task that you're working on, I think that that's important to include too. So maybe you say, you know, I created this program using XYZ. And it may be skills that you have listed also in your skill section, but I like to think about this as like the skill section is where you can tell the employer what skills you have, but in your bullet points, it's where you can really show them. So it's nice to have those skills also referenced in the bullet point where you actually were using that particular skill. So it really helps the reader add some context to what it is that you're describing. We talk about, you'll hear a lot of people talk about quantifying your bullet points where you can. And sometimes this is easier in certain situations than others, but it can be a great way to show results of what you're working on. So one way you can quantify is by talking about the size of whatever it is that you're working on, how many people you worked with, how many programs events you planned, how many, you know, if for student club type of, if you're describing some work that you did as part of student club, like how many events you planned, how many attendees you worked with, if you're a TA, like how many students were in that you were responsible for, how many papers you graded, you know, just adding some quantity to the pieces of the experience that you're describing. It could be how many hours a week that you spent on that activity as well. So just all of those numbers give the reader just a little more context about what you're working on. If there's an opportunity to quantify it in terms of the actual results from something that you're working on, if you were improving a process or, you know, creating something that was a new way of handling an old task that saved time or saved money or, you know, made a process easier to do, like I think those sometimes lend themselves to quantifying too. So if it saves, you know, if it saves money by, you know, less time, having less employees that have to spend time on a certain process, you might say something like, worked with or created a new process for handling invoices that saved you know, 10% of employee time on the process, or that's not a very eloquent way of saying that, but there's definitely some types of work that you might do where you can think about like, how is this making things better, and how can I describe how that made the process better. Maybe it's increasing the number of members that you have in an organization that you're working with. If you're fundraising for an organization, maybe it's increasing the amount of dollars that you fundraise. If you are responsible for a budget of some type, quantifying the amount of dollars that you're responsible for are also all ways that you can try to quantify those results. Sometimes it's helpful to think about what you're working on in terms of what was the hard part of that job. Like, what did I have trouble with, or where did I get stuck and need to look for a better way of doing something, or where were those sticking points? And a lot of times that can help you kind of think through the details and the kind of important pieces of your project or your experience that you might want to include. So again, just to say again, I think that that students tend to not go into enough detail when they're thinking about the bullet points and how they want to describe something. So it's easier to kind of pare back if you get too wordy. So don't be afraid, the first time to really kind of put in all the information and then go back and edit out some of the things that are least related. So one thing to think about also with your bullet points is the language that you use and how you can make sure that you're using the language and the terminology and the keywords that employers are looking for. And this kind of goes back to talking about the applicant tracking system, where resumes are scanned and they're scanned for certain keywords that the employers are looking for. And those keywords are also going to be in the job description. So really kind of looking closely at the job description side by side with your resume can be a good way to make sure that you're using keywords that that they're looking for, because they've told you in the job description what they're looking for. Making sure you have incorporated those keywords wherever you can and wherever it makes sense to in your resume and in those bullet points. There's a tool that I like to use for sometimes when you have maybe it's a common kind of job that you're having a hard time really kind of thinking through the why and the who and the how. Maybe you were a lifeguard over the summer, or you worked in a retail organization, but there's an online tool that I like to use called Job Hero that has a search bar where you can search a common job title, or you can search any job title, and it will give you some samples of ways of resumes that have that job title and the descriptions that they have. And it can be just a little bit of inspiration sometimes for how you might want to describe that position on your own. I think it can be sometimes helpful just to see, again, some samples of ways that other people have described work that maybe you hadn't thought of yet. So it's called Job Hero, and a quick Google can get you there. But there's just a search bar that you can use from their main page to look for some inspiration for how you might describe some of those, maybe what are generally part-time kinds of positions that you'll have on your resume.
Dana, I put the link in the chat, but is it the Job Hero Resume Builder or Job Hero Jumpstart Your Career?
It's not the Resume Builder. I think that's,
okay.
That's another.
So I just put that in the chat.
Okay, thanks. Heather and Francis, anything that you all want to add about bullet points and making your bullet points strong and effective?
Not for that, but I did have another question in the chat about security clearances and whether to include those, or if you include them where. And I just had mentioned that I usually include them in the top with the contact information. And usually if I have a name on the first line, contact information like email address and phone number on the next line, and then usually I'll have the security clearance information on a standalone line by itself. On that third line. So that's where people commonly put it. And if anyone else had that question, I just wanted to bring that up here as well.
Yeah, I think security clearance can be, a lot of employers are looking for that, especially, in the defense industry. So it can be, if you have that already, it can be super helpful to include that on your resume as well. Okay. Okay, so Heather had gone over a few of these before, but I'll just mention again, if you get a draft of your resume made and you use these tips and feel like you've got a good start, but you just want another set of eyes on it, there are a number of ways to do that. Like Heather said, VMOC is a tool that we use at the university that we've had for a couple of years. That's a resume review that's based on AI and machine learning. It has like 100 different parameters that it will evaluate your resume around. And I'll say that students I've talked to that have used it have been pleasantly surprised by the quality of the feedback that they get. I think a number have approached it fairly skeptically, but I think it's a tool that can be very valuable. It's just another way to get some feedback. And I think it's also kind of getting better all the time. So the more students that use it, the better it gets at evaluating those parameters. We're going to have employers do resume reviews for us on Fridays starting August 27th, and then on the 3rd and September 10th. So keep an eye out for information about that. That's a great way to have an employer perspective. I think one thing that you'll find is that there is no hard and fast rule about resumes and what preferences people have. So you might hear different things from an employer in their review. You might hear different things even from me or from Francis or Heather or from the main career center. And at the end of the day, some of it's going to be your personal preference, your gut feeling about what represents you the best. But there is no like one specific way to write a resume, as you'll discover. So in addition to the employer resume reviews, the main career center is doing a resume marathon on the 2nd. And then another tool that I like is called Job Scan, and I've put it here, and it will let you scan your resume and upload a job description, and it will help you figure out if you've used keywords in your resume that appear in the job description. And I think you can do 2 scans for free. So I think it's a good way to maybe after you do 2 and see kind of what the feedback is, then you can kind of then you probably are better able yourself at kind of looking at a job description and your resume and making sure that keywords in that job description are also reflected in your resume. And then obviously you can make an appointment to come in and see one of us individually to take a look at your resume too, through Handshake. So we are, that's probably one of our most common types of appointments that we have. The email today that went out for day 2 of Career Week also included a lot of information about other types of documents that you'll need as part of your job search process. So it had some information about writing a cover letter, which is probably would be the next step in the process, with some good samples and information about what each paragraph of the cover letter needs to include. There's information about writing thank you notes, or writing messages to employers if you need to ask for more time before you make a decision, or if you or need to decline if you've been offered a position but you need to decline. So lots of good information in that email and on our website about other types of correspondence that you may make with employers. Any other questions that anyone has about their resume, or what to include or what not to include? Or it's definitely a work in progress, and you will be tweaking it, as probably every time you look at it, you might find something else that you want to change or add or take off. So just know that it's a work in progress, and it's probably never in a perfect state. But the more eyes you have on it, the more people you have take a look, the more targeted and the more effective your resume will be.
Thank you everyone for being here today. I have had quite a few questions come in directly to me through the chat, and I believe I've answered all of those. So thank you for engaging in that way as well.
All right, well, we're just a little past time, so I want to let everyone go. But again, if you all the recordings will be posted on our website and connected to our YouTube channel. So if you have to want to go back and review something, or if you're going to miss one of the upcoming events, that will be available. But we're happy that you're here with us today, and look forward to hopefully seeing you on ground soon or at another event.